It's been 6 years since Sekiro first came out, and it still has the best sword combat of any game I've ever played. I wanted to find out why, so I analyzed the game frame by frame and found 3 things that Sekiro does that make it such a great game. That led me down a rabbit hole of digging into the game's sound files and examining the animations of the game to figure out why this game felt so good. So point number 1 of 3, I want to talk about why the basic mechanics of the game are genius. Sekiro is one of the most influential sword games. The L1 to block and R1 to attack system is so iconic, I've only ever heard this control scheme called Sekiro controls. When you tap the deflect button, you go into a state for 0.2 seconds, or 12 frames, where you will parry incoming attacks, taking out a big chunk of the enemy's posture bar if they hit you. The entire game is built around this posture bar, and the game's emphasis on it is crucial to understanding this first thing I found. There was this one time where I swung at this guy that was building up his attack, and I knew I had the right frame data. I knew I'd hit him before his attack hit me, but he stops mid-attack and deflects my attack. Why? Why does this happen? It's because the entire game is built on this posture bar. I don't think they get enough credit for this. Just think for a moment about how easily this mechanic could have felt like just another health bar. Instead, they inverted how health bars work. Health bars are ticking down when the player attacks, but posture bars are ticking down when the player defends. On its own, this system doesn't work with FromSoft's combat. What's to stop the player from ignoring the posture bar altogether and just slicing through the campaign? Well, to encourage the player to learn defense, they made the attacks weaker, but faster than they had in any of their previous games. This strikes a nice balance because it forces the player to learn to parry, but it still keeps attacks relevant to the gameplay. That's all great, but how does that explain why enemies can start defending mid-attack? Well, attacks are so fast in this game that the players can infinitely bully enemies into a corner, giving them no room to make an attack of their own. Enemies have to cheat the system a little bit by deflecting mid-attack to tell the player it's time to play the real game, the defensive game. This could have been annoying, but instead it introduces a cadence to the game. Being forced into a defensive state makes the combat feel like a dance. Learning how to take turns two-stepping with the Guardian Ape is the fun of the game. Is that how two-stepping works? I don't actually know. Either way, they somehow made a game about playing defensive game of the year, and I think that goes underappreciated. So with the mechanics out of the way, I want to use the next 2 points to talk about why the parry mechanic feels great visually. Before I started making this video, I thought back to this game and vividly remembered the most immersive combat. When 2 attacks collided, the swords would bounce off of each other, just like the samurai movies. Analyzing the game frame by frame, I realized how sloppy the animations are, why that's a good thing, and most importantly, how the game gets away with it. In theory, a game could have perfectly realistic sword combat if it used a ton of procedural animations. The easiest example of procedural animation is stairs. In a game like Mario 64, Mario gets rotated to match the incline of the stairs. To do this, they just took the walk animation and rotated it a little bit. But now games can create animations that match the player's feet to each individual step. This is called procedural animation, and people have taken this concept to the world limit and back. But why doesn't Sekiro use procedural animations to match swords to each other? Well, just some issues off the top of my head. Sword swing animations would have to change based on the player's position and angle. Oh, and that'd have to be multiplied by 2 because it'd be based on the angle and position of their sword. Oh, and multiply that by 2 to account for enemies and their swords. With just a little more thought, I realized this system would take a lot more effort. Instead of pouring all their dev time into this, Sekiro pulls off point number 2, a neat little cart trick. From Software uses this visual effect, which is, in my opinion, the most important part of Sekiro's combat. This is the parry effect, and when you're watching the game at full speed, you're no longer obsessing over whether or not the blades actually hit each other. You see, when you hit a parry, this effect covers almost half the screen, and inherently, you know you did something badass. This effect covers up so much of the screen because it's so important to the combat, but it also covers up the game's imperfections by distracting the player from the actual collision of the blades. When you take out a posture bar and this big flashy effect comes up on screen, it hides the quirks of the game like David Blaine hiding a card behind you here. But when this effect doesn't pop up when you take out a posture bar, this leads to some weird snapping effects that are about as well hidden as my DS under the covers. People will only remember the part of an animation that sticks out the most. From Software uses this easy effect to give you the feeling of the parry rather than spending thousands of dev hours to get the parry to look one-to-one with reality. When you watch this game frame by frame, you'll notice that the blades rarely ever touch each other. Some enemy swords take complete 180 turns mid-swing. Sometimes enemy swords will stick completely through the player's model, but you don't notice that when there's this big bing-bong effect blowing up half your screen. When you play the game at normal speed, this magic covers up the game's imperfections. I believe tricks like this are what allow From Software to put out so many more games than other developers. And all this isn't to say that this is a fault of the game. It just shows that game developers don't need to make things work exactly like they do in reality in order to make an effect feel good in the game. Sekiro created an effect so visually satisfying that I had to watch this game frame by frame just to notice this issue. And it's game design genius because this one parry effect can be used for every attack in the game regardless of the weapon the enemy's holding, or if they're even holding a weapon to begin with. But to end point number 2, here's the question of the hour. Would this game be any better if it had procedural animations? Well, we don't have to look far to get our answer. Ghost of Tsushima actually does have the swords perfectly clang against each other. Ghost uses this much less flashy parry effect to show off the perfect collision of the swords because a lot of development time definitely went into this. And I don't want to diminish the work of those developers. This is super cool, but respectfully, I don't care. I think the combat in Ghost feels and looks worse. Given the option between frame-perfect sword combat or a flashy parry effect, I'm going Sparky Boom Boom effect every day. That's my Overwatch route showing. Alright, so I love that effect, but for my third point, I must report a problem. This effect is used for both the enemy and player parries. Shouldn't that leave the player a bit confused as to whose attack is actually deflected? I know that in general, if you press the deflect button, you should expect to be the person deflecting. But if you're quick, you can cancel your own attacks with the deflect. So in theory, that can leave things a bit muddy and less understandable, especially for other people watching the gameplay. I also know that it's a sword game, so all the swords should look and act the same, but I've always held the belief that you should have visual language that distinguishes between your attacks and the enemies. Kind of like how Enter the Gungeon has red enemy bullets, so the game generally gives the player absolutely anything other than a gun with big red bullets. So this last point is less of a point and more of a question, or a cry for help, I'm not sure. No matter what I picked apart, I could not find a significant difference between Sekiro's deflect and an enemy deflect. I even had a theory that the player and enemies use different sound files, so I spent hours trying to find the sound file of the deflect. They don't, by the way. I found the exact sound files and matched the exact pitch shift, and it's the same between the enemy and the player. You have no idea how many programs I had to download to figure this out. Another thing that I think is too small to clearly define player deflects and enemy deflects are the animations themselves. The player will only ever go into 3 different poses after hitting a deflect, and sometimes the enemy will snap backwards after having their attack deflected. These just feel too inconsistent for a viewer to distinguish what's going on. My only other theory is that the pitch is shifted up for enemy attacks and down for player attacks. Either way, it says something that when I watch gameplay, I'm not that confused on what's going on. I didn't expect to have one of the few things I understood about game design challenged by going frame by frame in sword game. And yeah, that's all I've got to talk about with Sekiro's sword system. But in replaying this game, I fell in love with the first level, and I started writing the script on the game design genius in that level. It teaches the player how to play the game just like 1-1 in Mario teaches the player how to play a platformer. So if you want YouTube to recommend it to you, make sure to subscribe, but also don't subscribe if you only want Souls content because I'm going to be doing some other game development projects soon. Either way, thank you so much for watching.